When I was 8 years old, my family took a trip down to Florida to visit the Universal Studios Islands of Adventure. It was a fun theme park, but the one attraction that still sticks out in my mind as particularly great is a roller coaster that used to be there, Dueling Dragons. It has sadly since been torn down, but at the exit to that ride there was a gift shop with all sorts of dragon-themed merchandise. I bought two things from that gift shop that day, a Dueling Dragons t-shirt and an unassuming little card game called Dragon Hunt, and just like it says on the box, this was indeed my ticket to the kingdom of Wyvern.
First released in 1995, Wyvern was a trading card game designed by Mike Fitzgerald and published by US Games Systems. It was one of many fantasy trading card games to come out in the wake of Magic the Gathering, and between its debut in 1995 and its demise just 3 years later in 1998, Wyvern only ever received 5 sets. 3 printings of the core set, in Premier Limited, Limited, and Kingdom editions, with 240 cards between them, and 2 expansions, Phoenix and Chameleon, which added 90 cards each. And that was it. Wyvern only ever received a scant 420 different cards. Of course, that's not unusual for a game this short-lived. These days, if you've heard of Wyvern, it's probably because of a famous misprint. To make a long story short, it was made in the same factory as Magic the Gathering at the time, and a small number of cards that went out in Wyvern's Premier Limited Edition were mistakenly printed as cards for Magic's Fallen Empires expansion instead. So they were Magic cards on the front, and Wyvern cards on the back. Unfortunately, I don't have any of these famous Wyvern-backed Fallen Empires cards to show you because they're pretty sought after by collectors and go for over $100 a piece. And I am not made of money. Even so, despite its modern-day obscurity outside of that one curiosity for Magic collectors, for one brief moment, Wyvern did have a fan base, and those who played it tend to remember it fondly. So let's get into it, shall we? The first thing you'll notice is the artwork. It's nice and big, you can see all the little details right on the cards. Strangely, all the illustrations were done by the same artist, Peter Prosalnik. I apologize to any Polish viewers if I butchered that pronunciation, which gives a nice uniform feel to all the cards. They have this very cool pulp fantasy comic book look to them, which reminds me a bit of early Magic. I dig it. What I'm less keen on is the flavor text. Only a small number of cards have any, and it's generally really short and lacking in detail. Shenlong is a Chinese guardian dragon. Wow, thanks so much for the cool lore, game! Seriously, if you're going to put this little effort into your flavor text, just don't have flavor text. It's not like it's a requirement. The second thing you'll notice is that all these cards have a really nice quality to them. Thick cardboard, vivid colors, there's even a subtle shine effect to the gold ink on the backs. Overall, it's a very solid product from this standpoint. But of course, the quality of the physical cards isn't what determines whether a game is good or not. Otherwise, the Pokemon TCG with its flimsy, easily bent cardboard would have failed. No, what makes or breaks a card game is its gameplay. One of Wyvern's more unique gameplay features is that instead of one deck, you have 2. 20-card Dragon Den and a 50-card Treasure Hoard. In your Dragon Den deck, you've got your Dragon and Terrain cards, and your Treasure Hoard is filled with treasure and action cards. Oddly, while you can have up to 4 copies of any card in your Treasure Hoard, as is typical for most trading card games, cards in the Dragon Den are limited to 1 apiece. I guess because you only needed 20 cards in that deck, they decided being able to have 4 copies of only 5 different cards could be potentially game-breaking, so it's understandable, I guess. Just a little annoying if there was a particular dragon you wanted to build your deck around or something. The other unique thing about Wyvern is that you don't start with an empty board that you fill with creatures as the game goes on. Instead, you draw 6 cards from your Dragon Den at the start of the game, and arrange them as you wish in 6 spots on your battlefield, in a front row and a back row. These start the game face down, but will be turned face up and revealed to your opponent as the game goes on. Dragons are your creatures in this game, and all of them are dragons, supposedly. There are some weird choices here, creatures that are called dragons in this game, but that are pretty obviously not actually dragons. Since when is a griffin a dragon? Each dragon has a strength score, and some have other abilities, like flying, scout, subterranean, or other more unique skills. Flying is the most common of these abilities, and it ties into the front and back rows on your battlefield. Yes, in a rarity for games like this, card placement actually matters. Ordinarily, a dragon can only attack targets that are in the next row over, which in practice means only your front row can attack, and they can only target your opponent's front row. But if a dragon can fly, then they have the option to jump over one row and hit a target 2 rows away. Some cards also have Super Flyer, which means they can jump over 2 rows and attack any card from anywhere. In addition to your dragons, your dragon den will also contain terrain cards. These are like traps that you play face down mixed in with your dragons. And when a dragon attacks a terrain, it attaches to that dragon, generally weakening them in some way or sometimes killing them outright. Afterward, you draw a new card from your dragon den to replace the spent terrain. And this is where the scout ability comes into play. If a dragon attacks a terrain, but that dragon is a scout, then the terrain is destroyed outright without any effect and is not replaced. So despite scouts tending to be pretty weak in battle, it's worth putting a few in your deck to seek out and neutralize your opponent's terrain cards without letting them cripple your main fighting force. All of this works together to create an interesting dynamic to the play of a match. There's a lot to consider when deciding how to arrange your cards. Do you want to push all of your flyers up front so they can swoop in and hit your opponent's back row? Or do you want them in the back where non-flyers can't target them? And where do you want to put down your terrain cards to maximize the odds of your opponent bumbling into them without a scout? You can also move cards around during the course of the game, so you have some room to adapt your strategy to changing situations as things play out. I love games that feature card placement as a mechanic like this, because it means you need to keep in mind not only what you have, but who your opponent is, and how they like to arrange their cards. As you play, you don't just learn what cards your opponent is using, but also how they like to use them. And eventually you can start making some decent educated guesses as to what you'll find before a card flips up. It adds an extra layer of strategy to the play, and it's a lot of fun. As for the other deck, your treasure hoard is essentially your main deck of cards. All of the cards in your hand will come from here, and it's where most of the strategy in the game comes from. The most common type of card in your treasure hoard, despite the name, will most likely be action cards. Actions come in several varieties and are like spells or sorceries with a single one-time effect. There are a few different kinds of action cards. Regular actions are basic effects that you can use outside of combat during either player's turn. Dragon Slayer actions let you target and kill any face-up dragon that fits the criteria listed on the card without going into combat. You can't attack normally on the turn that you use a Dragon Slayer, and you're limited to 1 per turn, but unless a dragon is outright immune to the things, they can be very useful if you don't want to risk a head-on fight. Battle actions, as you might expect, can only be used during battle. And reactions counter the play of certain other types of cards. The other type of card in your treasure hoard is, well, treasures. These are your artifacts, your continuous spells. You get 4 slots for these, 2 in each row, and they remain in play until they're either replaced with new ones or destroyed. Some of them only affect dragons in their own row, so like with dragons, knowing where to place your treasures is important. And that's it. All of your cards will fall into one of those types. Wyvern didn't last long enough to start introducing tons of new mechanics and card types, but there's still some depth here. Between the 2 expansions it did get, Phoenix introduced 2 new varieties of action cards, and Chameleon added new mechanics to expand the functionality of terrain cards. Sadly, I can't really go into these in detail, because while booster boxes from the base set of Wyvern are easy enough to come by, getting your hands on Phoenix or Chameleon packs is difficult and will cost you a bit of cash. Maybe someday I'll be able to get those extra cards and see how they affect the game, but for now this video will exclusively cover the base set, since that's what I have. One thing you might have noticed in some of the cards is these little gold coin symbols beneath the artwork, and that's another unique element to Wyvern. Instead of building up a resource like mana as the game goes on, you begin with a full war chest which then depletes over time. Both players start with 25 gold pieces, and that is it. That's all you get. There are a few cards that let you get more, and you can also obtain gold when your opponent attacks terrain cards, the Gold pieces printed on these aren't a cost, rather how much you get when they attach to a dragon in a briefly confusing inconsistency. But for the most part, what you start with has to last you the whole game. Many cards cost nothing to play, but if there are any coins here on the card, then you need to spend that much gold to play the card. If you can't pay, you can't use the card. And this also applies to dragons when they're turned face up for the first time. This adds yet another dynamic to consider when deciding how you want to play. You can throw out all your high-cost cards early on, but you'll burn through your treasury fast and leave yourself with nothing in the late game. But if you're too afraid to spend any gold, then you're locking yourself out of using any of the more powerful cards. It's a balancing act, and yet another aspect of this game that I personally love. Now let's talk about the fun part, the dragons. When two dragons go head-to-head, you compare their strength scores and the higher number wins. At this time, both players can play as many battle action cards as they want, whether to beef up your own dragon or weaken your opponent. Some cards even let you bring in other dragons to help out, letting you add their strength scores together into an even bigger number, but risking the deaths of both of them if you happen to lose. And this is where the game is at its best, as both you and your opponent clash in a barrage of spells, powering up and countering, trying to maneuver your dragon into the stronger position until someone runs out of cards or gold, or just cuts their losses. Unfortunately, this sort of back and forth happens far less often than it really should, and most battles are over pretty quickly. Interestingly, unlike most battle card games, in Wyvern, you cannot skip your battle phase. You are required to either attack or replace. If you don't want to or can't attack, you have to pick one of your dragons or terrains to discard and replace with another one drawn from your dragon deck. I'm not sure how I feel about this mechanic. It's interesting and does help to keep the game from devolving into an endless stalemate, but it's hard to say whether or not it's unambiguously positive. In another change from the common formula, you do not have any sort of life or hit points. Instead, you win the game if you destroy all 6 of your opponent's dragons and terrain cards. In most games that give the player life points, that life inevitably becomes more of a resource to be spent than an actual vitality score, making the game flow harder to track at times. Pinning victory entirely on the state of your battlefield instead makes things a lot simpler, and means it's far easier to tell which player is in the lead at any given time. In Wyvern, if you lose a dragon, it's always a negative. And this brings me to the last unique element to Wyvern's play. Matches are not decided in a simple 2 out of 3 format. At the end of the game, you earn points. The winner gets 25 points, plus 1 point for each of the remaining gold pieces and dragon or terrain cards still in play. The loser also gets points, but only equal to half of the remaining gold pieces rounded down. And the first to 50 or 100 points wins the match. On the one hand, this is a very cool change from the common match structure. In theory, it rewards not just winning, but winning efficiently, and because you still get some points either way, you will get something even when you lose. On the other hand, the way points are distributed is drastically uneven in the winner's favor, meaning that in practice, it really does come down to which player wins more rounds than the other, and the emphasis on efficiency just gets thrown out the window. This also means that matches can take a lot longer than other card games, especially if you're playing to 100, so if you want to play Wyvern, you need to have patience. And that's really Wyvern in a nutshell. In its experimentation with the standard trading card game formula, it hit on some brilliant ideas, but the overall execution is very hit and miss. And while I do personally really like this game, it is very dated. In fact, one of Wyvern's most unique features is also perhaps its biggest problem, and that's the fact that you start with a full board that diminishes as you lose battles. It might not seem like a big deal at first, but in practice, this creates a severely unstable equilibrium. In Wyvern, every one of your opponent's dragons that you take out not only brings you closer to victory, it also reduces your opponent's manpower, making it harder for them to win. In other words, every step towards winning just makes winning easier. Coupled with how difficult it is to refill an empty space on your battlefield, I only know of one card that can do that. It's unlikely for a player to catch up once they start to lose badly. It would help if there was some sort of comeback mechanic built into the game, like the revenge meter in Street Fighter IV, but as it is, games tend to be mostly decided pretty early on. For another thing, turn phases are far too rigid. Most games give you a draw phase, some sort of standby phase for automatic once per turn effects to go off, 1 or 2 main phases, and a combat phase. Wyvern is ridiculous with its phases and how insanely specific they all are. Let me break it down.
First you get your draw phase, and there is no standby phase or upkeep here, so your once per turn effects will often go off during the draw phase instead, which makes it needlessly complicated. Then you get your treasure phase, during which you can place a single treasure card from your hand into one of your 4 slots. You cannot play a treasure card outside of this phase. Let me repeat. You cannot play treasure cards outside of the treasure phase. This will be important later. After the treasure phase comes the movement phase. Here you can shuffle the positions of up to 2 of the cards in your battlefield, whether they're dragons, terrain, or treasure. Then there's your action phase, during which you can play action cards from your hand or activate action-type abilities of your face-up dragons and treasures. There's no limit to the number of actions you can play in a given turn, and the phase doesn't end until both players are finished, so this phase can occasionally last for a while. After the action phase is the battle phase. Unless you've used a Dragon Slayer during the action phase, you need to either attack with a dragon or swap out one of your cards. Then you get a second action phase. You can't play Dragon Slayers during the second one, but otherwise it's the same as your first. Last is the end phase, and then it's your opponent's turn.
That's 8 phases per turn, which may not sound like a lot, but when each one is so completely specialized and rigid, it gets very stifling.
For example, like I said before, you can't play treasure cards outside of the specific treasure phase, which means that if you drop a whirlpool during your action phase and happen to draw into an awesome treasure like Aaron's Rod, then that's too bad because you can't play it this turn.
I get they wanted to limit the number of treasures you can play in a given turn, but you don't need a specialized phase for that. Magic only lets you play 1 land per turn, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Only lets you normal summon 1 monster per turn, but both of those happen during their game's respective main phases. This on top of all of the different effects that need to trigger during the draw phase due to the lack of a dedicated standby phase, and it's just baffling. Wyvern could easily have added a standby phase, and then had the treasure, movement, and action phases folded together into first and second main phases, and the game probably would have been a lot better for the added flexibility. It even reached the point that during the match I played with a friend to prepare for this video, we stopped paying attention to the specific order of those phases before we were done, just because it was too much of a pain to do it the way it's written.
Another one of the more inexplicable things about Wyvern is the way card resolution works. Whether you call it the stack, the chain, or something else, most trading card games that have cards played in sequence follow a first in, last out order for resolving their effects, with the last card played resolving first and then going back through them all in reverse order. Not so in Wyvern. Instead, cards are resolved in the same order they're played, with the only exceptions being reaction cards, which go off before and block the card played directly before them, or cards that directly prohibit another card or effect. This means, for example, if your opponent uses Cadmus to kill one of your flying dragons, using a magic wand to take away that dragon's ability to fly will not save it, because Cadmus's effect goes off before the magic wand does. The only way to block Cadmus would be with a reaction card that counters Dragon Slayers.
Not only does this cut down on the potential for interesting card interactions, it makes things needlessly complicated. And if you're used to other trading card games, it just feels wrong. And it's not even the only place where things feel inconsistent.
Some dragons and treasure cards feature effects that are treated like actions. These effects can be activated anytime you can use an action card, but the cards themselves don't actually specify how many times you can use them. To answer that question, you need to open up the rulebook. If there's a cost to the effect, like paying gold or discarding cards, then you can use that effect as often as you want, as long as you can pay for it. On the other hand, if there isn't a cost, then it's limited to 1 use per turn. I think the card text really could have stood to be a lot clearer on this distinction, especially when Gargoyle, whose ability both has a cost and is restricted to 1 use per turn, has that actually specified in its text. There's plenty of extra room in these text boxes, guys. There's no reason you couldn't just print the words once per turn on the card where necessary for the sake of clarity. There are also a few cards that are just way too ambiguous in their wording, like Indra's Spell. It says that it counters any weather-related action card, but what exactly constitutes weather-related? Something like hailstorm or fog is obvious, but what about earthquake? What about avalanche? Are they weather related?
This is the sort of ambiguity that you never ever want in a competitive game like this, because it inevitably leads to arguments with a lot of shouting and pages upon pages of errata text.
It's also a little annoying that all of the cards have the same art on the back, even though they go into two separate decks. Something on the back to denote whether a card belongs in the Dragon Den or the Treasure Hoard would have been a nice convenience in case the two decks ever end up shuffled together by mistake. They don't even have any of the card game on the back, just a big W. This really should have been redesigned. This one's just a minor nitpick, but out of all three abilities with special keywords, Flying, Scout, and Subterranean, Subterranean is not only the least useful, it's pretty worthless in general. It does literally nothing on its own. Some cards can enhance Subterranean dragons, letting them attack any target like a Super Flyer or combine their strengths in battle without using a help card, but unless you want to build your whole deck around this skill, it's really not worth it.
And there aren't even enough Subterranean dragons to let you effectively focus a deck around the mechanic, which makes me question what the point of it was. But that's just a microcosm of the biggest issue with the card design. There are so many cards that are just flat out useless. Just in this base set, there are more than half a dozen cards that exist entirely to counter a single effect, or even a single specific card.
So unless your opponent is running several copies of Dwarven Army, which isn't even that great of a card anyway, Flood is just a complete waste of a slot in your deck that could otherwise go to literally any other card. Why would you ever run something like Flood or Frost Breathing or Fog, which counter a single card each, when you could just as easily fill out a playset of Armor, which counters any of those, or any other strength modifier card? These junk cards just fill out the set and add nothing of value to the game.
Perhaps the absolute nadir of this problem is these two cards right here, Giant Ants and Giant Anteater. Giant Ants gives +2 strength to only Subterranean dragons. You can accomplish the same thing with a magical sword, which works with any dragon, including ones with less useless abilities. And then there's Giant Anteater. Giant Anteater counters the play of Giant Ants. Only Giant Ants. And I will remind you that Armor is also a card that exists. So you have a card that is borderline worthless, and another card that only does anything if your opponent happens to be using that worthless card.
Both of these cards are rares. I could not make this up if I tried. Every Wyvern booster pack contains one rare, and you could pull something amazing, like a dragon that's immune to Dragon Slayers and gives you more gold every turn. Or you could pull Giant Anteater.
In fact, the rarities of some of these cards are hilarious when you think about them. What comes to mind when you think of rare cards in fantasy trading card games? Powerful weapons, legendary gods and heroes. Ravens?
Not even enchanted ravens, just ravens. A generic town is of a higher rarity than Zeus. Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, is a common. I have 10 of him. Zeus!
Even just the number of rare cards in this set is all kinds of unbalanced in general. Not counting the two ultra-rare gold and silver Wyvern cards that were exclusive to the Premier Limited Edition printing, Wyvern's core set contains 80 common cards, 80 uncommon cards, and 79 rares. That is far too few commons and uncommons, and way too many rares. For comparison, the 2019 core set for Magic the Gathering contains 123 commons, 86 uncommons, and only 68 rares. With so few commons and so many rares, after 2 booster boxes, I have ended up with numerous duplicates of every single common and only about 2/3 of the rares. With 36 booster packs per box, you would need to get a minimum of 3 boxes before you could possibly build a complete set of rares, and that's assuming you get lucky with fewer than 30 duplicates.
It gets pretty bad with cards like Whirlpool, which is basically Pot of Greed, meaning of course you need to have 4 copies in your deck if you want it to be viable. Except that it's a rare, and I can't even imagine trying to build a full playset after everything I just said.
I don't even have an excuse for this. To be completely fair, Wyvern was a very early TCG, so some growing pains are to be expected. This was a new thing, people hadn't really figured out what they were doing yet. But Wyvern debuted in 1995. Magic had been out for 2 years and received 5 expansions by this point. That was plenty of time to crib a few notes and learn how to design a decent set of cards. So how does Wyvern ultimately hold up? Well, it's complicated. It's very flawed, and there are a lot of broken cards.
If this game had lasted long enough to start seeing ban lists, I am 100% positive that Meteor Shower would have been one of the first cards banned.
The game is also quite a bit more simple overall than something like Magic is nowadays, and there are far fewer interesting card interactions than some other games have. But this was a really solid base that could very easily have been refined and expanded upon over time with some revisions to the rules and the addition of new cards. Wyvern really could have been something special if it had just lived long enough to grow and develop. As for Dragon Hunt, this was actually a pretty interesting product.
Released in 1997, near the tail end of Wyvern's life, Dragon Hunt was a standalone game containing a set of Dragon Den and Treasure Hoard decks that would be shared by 2 players, featuring reprints of cards from the base set, plus 2 from the Phoenix expansion.
Dragon Hunt is heavily stripped down compared to the trading card game. There are no treasure cards, no subterranean dragons, no dragons with any abilities except flying or scout in fact, and no action cards except for battle actions and 2 reactions. The included cards are also limited to ones with simple effects in order to keep the game basic and easy to learn. It might make for a decent introduction to the TCG, except for one thing. The 2 games are not cross-compatible.
Sure, they're the same cards, but the backs are different.
Instead of the gold back with the large W, Dragon Hunt features these pink and yellow carved-looking images to separate its dragon and treasure decks, which is something I wish the TCG did, sure, but unfortunately it does mean that you can't use Dragon Hunt cards with your Wyvern collection. Unless you have opaque sleeves, I guess. Still, it was a neat idea. And since it even came with a booster pack of Wyvern cards, US Games probably hoped that Dragon Hunt would work as an introduction and attract new players who would eventually transition to the TCG. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and Wyvern would only receive 1 more expansion after this before dying a quiet death the next year, doomed to fade into obscurity. The sad part is, I would have loved to move on from Dragon Hunt to Wyvern, but I didn't find Dragon Hunt until around the year 2000, by which time Wyvern had already been dead for 2 years, meaning I could never find it in stores, and would have had no one to play with even if I did. There was so much potential in Wyvern. It tried to do a lot of things differently, and while some of those changes are definitely for the worse, it also does a lot of things that I really like and would love to see more of in new games. Heck, I wish Wyvern could make a comeback someday, a 2nd edition to iron out the kinks in the rules and refine the card design. Maybe as an LCG. Of course, that will never happen, but man can dream. But until the next time you pay me a visit, this is Craig, bidding you farewell from the Dungeon of the Discarded.
Hi there. This is the obligatory part of every YouTube video where I ask you to like the video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to my channel and click the little bell icon if you want to see more. Or don't. I'm not your mom. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. Do you have some other weird old card game you'd like to recommend for this show? Let me know. I have a list, but I am on the lookout for other games to cover. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to kick some money my way. More money lets me buy more old cards, which lets me make more videos faster. Also, a big thanks to my friend Damien for playing this game with me, and last but not least, I want to give a special shout out to my friend Bunny, who is a wonderful human being, and without whom this video, and by extension this show, would not exist.